Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 9 of Crusade, Racing the Night. Although interestingly, as I half expected when I was watching it, it was originally going to be the pilot for Babylon 5 Crusade. And I thought that was going to be the case just from the way that it was sort of playing out in the first few minutes. It was like everyone was sort of saying, and this is this, and that's that, and this is the other, and we've only just started it all over again. So I can see why they were thinking of using it as the pilot, and apparently Call to Arms would have aired very, very shortly before this episode. So JMS in his commentary basically said that he felt that they could get away without lots of exposition in what could have been the first episode, because Call to Arms would have been fresh in people's minds, but they clearly made a choice to go in a different direction. And what's funny is that the uniforms that you see some of the crew in here are the uniforms that were just introduced in the previous episode, because when it got to the end of this episode, this was actually 103 in the production order, which means it is a very, very early episode. So I guess that what actually happened with the uniform thing was that they started with grey uniforms and flipped them to black at some point. But in the play order that you see in the DVDs, they start with black and then flip to grey. And I'm guessing that the previous episode was used to explain that transition away to a certain extent, because it was actually produced probably last. It was 113. So Appearances and Other Deceits was production order 113. So I'm guessing that that's what they did, and they sort of slotted it in to use the last episodes that were done earlier, perhaps last in the actual running order, which is a curious little way of it. But that's Crusade. These things happened, and I do think that in many respects this episode is actually a better introduction to the series than the one they ended up using, simply because it's quite brave in a lot of what it's doing for the sort of the late 90s when it was filmed. You've got these sort of sweeping alien CGI generated landscapes, and it's actually not badly done. Now, I'm going to run you through the episode now, and there are bits where it just looks so out of date. Even for then, it just looks kind of clunky, because as JMS mentions in the commentary, computer games were starting to be able to generate these sorts of CGI quality in their cutscenes. So actually, at this point, B5 was almost kind of having to play catch up with what others were starting to do more day to day. So, the thing is, that being said, seeing this in a prime time science fiction TV show was still deeply unusual. The way in which they were doing it is clearly building on what they did with Babylon 5 and some of its exterior alien planet shots, which it was starting to do by season 5 more regularly. So, they're still being very, very brave. They're still really sort of pushing the envelope now with Crusade in the amount of stuff that they're doing week to week. But they're just probably, you'd have to keep throwing more and more resource at it to keep up with what other people are doing in other arenas, I guess, at this point. So, bearing in mind this was intended to be the pilot, we start with some exposition of how Gideon was actually picked by Sheridan to take on the mission to try and find a cure for the Drac Plague. And we have this interesting sort of meeting between him, a general, and a Drazi, a Brakiri, and a Gaim on board Babylon 5, where basically they're offering them free passage through their territory to try and find a cure for the plague. But the Drazi knows that Gideon is a betting man. Apparently he's had a run-in with a Drazi in a game, and so the Drazi decides to offer him a bet, and he bets that basically they can go all around the Drazi protected worlds for 4 years, but on condition that on the 5th year, when the people of Earth are getting really desperate, Excalibur will have to go back to Earth, and for the duration of the 5th year, blow up any ship that is desperate enough to try and leave Earth in order to protect other worlds from getting infected. So that's the deal that's on the table, basically. And apparently, according to the General, Gideon agrees to it. And the interesting thing about the flashback is we don't see Gideon until right at the last minute, because it's from his point of view, looking through his eyes. So we only see him in reflection in the shuttle as it approaches the Excalibur, which the General notes, is the best ship they've got, and so on. So it's kind of interesting that, it would seem quite odd to you if you'd seen all of the episodes up until this point. And JMS said apparently they did sort of tweak this sequence a little bit, but obviously they still had to use it. So there's certainly an interesting approach to it. And then we see that, in fact, it's presented as a sort of dream sequence. So anyway, he wakes up out of this recollection with Dr. Chambers calling him, and then we see him on a flying bike, just sort of roaming around this alien cityscape, which apparently is sort of perfectly preserved, but fundamentally devoid of life. And we've never sort of seen that before, and it's just sort of, yes, it looks dated now, but for the time, that was something completely different. That was impressively done. So and I did remember this episode, although actually I think I confused it with another one in my head. So it didn't end as I thought it was going to end. It was slightly different, but it was still a good episode. I think it was still pretty solid, although James's commentary is quite funny. I'll tell you about that towards the end. So Alison is busily dusting off various walls in a room on this planet. We never find out what the name of the planet is, I don't think. And he's finding fragments of equations that hint at all sorts of technological advances, which could earn himself and IPX presumably a lot of cash. But he hasn't actually found anything medical yet, curiously. So he's all about saving humanity, but he doesn't see why you can't turn a profit at the same time. And in conversation with Gideon, he notes that empires rise and fall, but corporations go on forever. There's a little bit of sort of social commentary there. And he likens it to being a sort of a library of Alexandria, but the odd thing is he hasn't found complete equations. All he's found is these sort of starting points to them. And it's all in very good condition. And Gideon's puzzled by that in conversation with Dr. Chambers, because she's found trace DNA fragments from at least 30 alien races in the soil, and yet the place is untouched. It's not been looted, it's not been raided. And Gideon finds that very odd, because you would expect people to have taken advantage of the situation. Clearly it's an abandoned alien city. You'd expect scavengers to have been by now, and yet everything is still in perfect order. He notes that there's Galen isn't around. Now, I think the quote was that he's least wanted, but turns up when he's most needed. So that apparently was the order. I thought at one point I thought it was the opposite way around, but maybe not. So Jarina is not about, because she's off crawling through an incredibly tight sort of tunnel, sort of conduit, discovering skulls, which she doesn't mention to anybody. And she also finds an enormous power source in a huge cavern. But her sort of desire to explore further is cut off by the fact that the crew have just found the body of a poor chap who was lasered in half, basically, a few minutes earlier, by something that we don't see. All we see is a beam striking his chest and his chest starting to catch fire, which is unpleasant. So essentially he's been vivisected, so he's had his organs removed. And then whilst they're debating how this might have happened when they didn't detect anything before, the Excalibur radios down to them and reports that objects are closing in on their position. And when Gideon looks out, he sees various flyers heading towards them. So Gideon tells everyone to bug out, but he's going to run interference for them. So he gets back on his sky bike and basically goes off, yells at the aliens to say, "Oi lads, over here," and pulls them away from the landing parties, and whizzes through buildings, manages to make one lose control and take itself out effectively. But it's obvious he's going to get cornered very, very rapidly. And it's at that point that Galen is most needed and does indeed show up and scoops him off the sky bike, which we don't actually see. But being Galen's ship, it just grabs him and boosts back out to orbit to rendezvous back with the Excalibur. So apart from that, they can't detect any more activity once they get back, and they'd been down there for 48 hours and all had been quiet. So it seems that they'd sort of just monitored them and waited for them, and then decided to have a go at them once they saw an opportunity to do so. Apparently, Galen doesn't have any grudges towards anyone because he did overhear what Gideon said about him, and because he has no surviving enemies. So take that as you will, basically. Galen is interested to hear that the victim was vivisected, and he says that he needs to go and pop and get something from his ship. So he goes to a travel tube and finds Jarina in the travel tube waiting for him, which is a very Garibaldi-esque thing. If you know your Babylon 5, you used to do it to Talia quite a lot. And we haven't really got much indication of this before now. But she's basically saying that she really wants to learn from him. And he says that revenge is not a good reason to want to acquire knowledge from him. And that, she needs to be sort of further along and more mature before he'll even consider offering that to her. So, she's not impressed by that as a concept at all, because basically she wants to strike back at the Drak because of what they did to her people, which is understandable. But, he basically says that she's got to grow out of her rage first. So, no help for her there. So, what he was going back to his ship for was a homunculus, which is basically a sort of like a life decoy model. It's basically a copy of him, which he controls, or I think he does control it remotely, effectively, but through technological means. It's not sort of telepathy or anything. So it's like a very sort of basic android-y sort of idea. So it goes down to the surface in a sort of probe, and the CGI for it is god-awful. But in fairness, looking at it now with more mature eyes, I can almost forgive that, in part because, there were limitations at that point in time. And that, I think they purposefully didn't want it to look too much like him, because it was supposed to be like a probe. So actually, I think that you can sort of justify the way it looks, because it's not supposed to be an exact duplicate. It's just supposed to be something that can walk around looking like a humanoid, in order that it can attract attention to itself, which it does. And when one of the attacking flyers shows up, he goes, "Oh look, something dreadful, the horror." And then as the decoy is vivisected, he says, "Oh, my liver! I wondered where that had got to." So it's quite entertaining. So he basically then detaches the head of the homunculus as it's being dissected, and his head goes up into the ship and manages somehow to maneuver itself into a sort of a viewing port. So on the bridge of the Excalibur, they can see everything that it's seeing, and the flyer arrives inside one of the sort of skyscrapery buildings, and they see that there is an enormous collection of various ships from different alien races. So there's a Vree flying saucer, there's a Narn heavy cruiser, there's a Centauri Vorchan, there's a Brokiri carrier. There's all sorts of ships in there, which of course are all, sort of CGI models being reused from Babylon 5 days. But it's very, very effective to give you an idea of just how much collecting and analysing has been going on by this unknown race. And they realised on the bridge of the Excalibur, of course, that the formulae that were on the walls out in the open, easy to find, were just cheese for the mousetrap. So the whole point of the city is basically to pull people in, so that people can be examined, researched, and apparently killed in order to have their biology analysed. So the scans that they undertake now from orbit, knowing that there's something else going on, reveal a lot of sort of underground catacombs. And when they go to maximum strength on the scanners, that unfortunately they took a response, but they now know that basically there are billions of people in cryonic, apparently not cryogenic, it's cryonic sleep. But when they do their maximum scan, they get caught in a gravity field, so effectively it's a tractor beam, and lots of the flyers launch out from an underground cavern and boost up into orbit to go and engage the Excalibur. So you can see why this would have been a good pilot episode, because now we get a space battle. So we get thunderbolts launching out from a sort of an exterior rack, and we also see conventional Star Furies as well. So it's a complete mix-up, and so they go and intercept the flyers. Excalibur's weapon systems open up, but it is well and truly stuck in a gravity field. And even when they send thunderbolts down to the surface, and this is very reminiscent of the bombing of Mars episodes in Babylon 5, their first strike doesn't take out the gravity field, and even with the Excalibur's engines at maximum, it can't make a difference. It can't pull out. So we can see now how the other ships were pulled down prior to this. So their only option is they let the Thunderbolts do another run on the off chance they can make a difference, and they do expose the primary power source. So Gideon orders the primary guns on Excalibur to fire, but pointing downwards, of course. So although it drains their power, it also kills the power source for the gravity field, which means that they can then regain their orbit. But they also then at that point get scanned. There's also a scene here where Gideon has this, like, he's got a sort of a screen on a periscope, and it's quite funny because although it's a nice idea, JMS says in his commentary that it was quite ungainly to film around, and they didn't have the technology then to put an LCD screen into the periscope screen as it comes down, so all it is a painting. So it doesn't the screen doesn't do anything, but it is seen quite a lot. So presumably they couldn't blue screen it or green screen it or whatever to superimpose an image. So it's just the same static image all the time, which JMS bemoans and wouldn't do again, basically. But I quite like the idea of having a periscope on a starship, because actually it makes perfect sense. And JMS says that he wanted the bridge to convey that sort of submarine feel. So that's why they went for that sort of design choice, which is an interesting one. So the ship gets scanned, quite a high-powered scan. Data gets pulled down, translation files get pulled down, and then a chap called Kulan appears on the bridge in hologram form, and he is the keeper of the world for this generation. And the source is from sort of 5 miles down, basically. So he is a member of the race which is in cryonic sleep under the surface of the planet, and he offers Gideon a sort of an orb to touch, and Gideon checks with Galen again and says, "Yep, I'm watching, go for it." And Kulan then reveals that basically, although they're not named, the shadows attacked his world because they declined to have a shadow base on it. So they did to this world what the Drak did to Earth. So they used what is presumably the same plague on these people. So these people also face the problem that Earth is now facing. But 3 years in, they realised that they didn't have the resources because they weren't as enabled for star travel as Earth is. So they were kind of trapped on their own planet, unable to do enough research to fix it. So they froze everyone, but every now and again someone is revived to look after the machinery and continue the experiments. And of course the experiments involve killing anyone who lands on the planet in order to try and find a race who either have met the plague before and cured it or have a natural immunity to it. Which I guess you would, because obviously you're trying to save your entire race, and they feel they're justified in taking this approach to do it. And Eilerson kind of thinks, well, yeah, I can see their point. Wouldn't we kill off a few hundred Narn if we thought we could save our entire species? We probably would. So this is the dilemma then that the crew are left with, because it's a Faustian deal basically. The guy is saying that if you keep our existence quiet, but you make sure that people keep getting sent to us, then we will share with you any information that we get, and obviously ultimately any cure that we develop you can have. But Gideon isn't going to go for that. He says that he can't morally accept the fact that others are going to die not voluntarily just in order to try and save Earth. They're not at that point yet. But as Kulan says, well, give it a couple of years, you might find that you do get to that point. But anyway, Gideon takes quite a hard line, and this guy isn't actually going to see them find the cure, odds are, because he's only got 6 months left, because he got woken up with only 2 years left to live, effectively. So they won't send others, but they do say that if they do get the cure, they will send it to them. So, Gideon is not unreasonable, he's not cutting him off. But having said that, Gideon does then proceed to clear the skies of all of their flyers. Now, we don't know how many they have. That might not be their entire force necessarily. But Gideon's clearly intending to make it a lot harder for them to actually harvest and indeed attack people. So I'm guessing what he's thinking is that whilst they might be able to take people who make it down to the surface, they won't have enough resources to take ships in orbit. So I guess he's just trying to level the playing field a little bit like that. So it's not really clear if they're hyperspace capable inherently. It seems that they're likely not. So maybe they'd have to rely on a jump gate if there still is one. But in any event, it's clear that this happened during the last Shadow War 1,000 years ago. So they're on this cycle of just trying to keep themselves going until they can find a cure at this point. So it's a very interesting dilemma that they're presented with, and JMS says this is the sort of thing obviously that he likes to explore, because it's kind of how far will you go in finding a cure, how much harm are you willing to do to others, and if you did do that much harm to others, what would that make you if you did then find a cure and survived? So it is definitely an interesting one. So they pull out and they're given a new target by Rangers, and Galen notes that Kulan's world wasn't a world that the Rangers originally gave them as a target, and Gideon just notes that he's got his own resources, and at the end of that episode we see that of course that resource is the Apocalypse box, and it has an Ace of Spades card in its lip as he opens it, which is an indicator of death. And Galen and Darina have an interesting conversation, because Darina lets slip when the homunculus is looking around that she's found these bodies, and she hadn't mentioned this before, and she notes that yes, it is wrong to withhold information, isn't it? But of course that's exactly what Galen's doing with her. So he does take her point, and they have a conversation where he's a little bit more open to teaching her, and she says, so I can hope, and he says that yes, there's always hope, they haven't found a way to kill it off yet. Not for want of trying, perhaps. So yeah, it's an interesting one, that one. And then as I say, it closes on the Apocalypse box and them getting another Gideon getting another target, I guess, and it's clear that obviously their voyages will continue. But I'm going to go a little bit into sort of it's not really spoiler territory, I suppose, but as you'll appreciate at this point, Crusade only ran 13 episodes. It never got the sort of shot at life that Babylon 5 got. So JMS in this commentary is quite effusive about how it would have gone and panned out as a series. And from what he says in this commentary, and this is where we will get into sort of spoilers for what could have been, it's quite interesting because he's saying that one of the reasons he put a lot of civilians onto the ship is because they act as wild cards. Because if you think about it, if everyone on the ship was military, there'd never be any conflict, because everyone would be towing the military chain of command type line, and it would be very hard to introduce conflict and therefore some interesting storylines. Whereas here we've got a doctor, we've got a Technomage, we've got an IPX operative, all of whom have slightly differing agendas depending on what the situation is. So he can leverage that to make more interesting stories, which is sort of part of why he set it up as he did. But what he also says really interestingly is that had things played out as he'd intended, they would actually have found the cure by the end of season 2. So actually quite quickly. But the knock-on effect of that would have been that in doing that, they would have uncovered the fact that elements on Earth were playing with shadow tech that they shouldn't particularly have had. And that would then mean that the Excalibur had to kind of go on the run, because they would be under constant threat, presumably from this faction of Earth that was trying to exploit shadow tech. And I think that the implication is that the ship that we see attack Gideon's previous ship, the Cerberus, was actually an Earth-developed shadow ship, because it's not a shadow ship we've seen before as a part of the Shadow Standard fleet, when we probably saw most of them by the end of the original Babylon 5 run. So I believe that the thinking was that somehow the Cerberus tripped across something it shouldn't have done, so they were silent, so they couldn't report back. So only Gideon, having been rescued by Galen, could actually do so. So that was clearly one of the plot lines they were going to explore, but didn't get a chance to. But that is directly from the proverbial horse's mouth. Some other interesting comments. He said that Galen's ship was intended to look like a magician's hat when you see it from the side. Now he said it, I can totally see it, because it would look like a sort of triangular sort of cone shape from the side. So that apparently was what he was going for, because it just makes perfect sense now that he said it. Also, the transport pods inside Excalibur are reused from the Mars tube transport pods that we see in Babylon 5. And I should have sort of called that, because it is a very, very similar looking system. But apparently they actually are exactly the same props and so on. Apparently JPL were providing them with sort of technical info. So when they said they wanted to be in a binary star system, JPL actually sort of said to them, well, okay, that's great. I think it's called it's short for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And so JPL said to them, well, okay, you've got light from 2 different sources then, which means that the light on the planet is going to look like this colour. And apparently the crew, when they were filming, sort of said, this light's wrong. But that's the reason why. It's because they were actually being very realistic with their physics in filming Crusade. So, again, you've got to sort of applaud it for that. And JMS said that he wanted them to do a lot of different alien environments. And I've thought that, just from watching this, is that, we've seen environments inside hyperspace. We've seen this planet, which for the time was doing lots of sort of interesting architectural stuff that clearly wasn't identical to an Earth-style planet, and so on. So it's kind of, I think we would have seen a lot of really interesting stuff. And I guess I would probably liken it to almost like sort of Strange New Worlds now, actually, because that's doing a lot of sort of interesting stuff in a sort of what I would call a quite traditional science fiction style, if you like. For someone like me who grew up when I grew up, the idea of doing away missions to a new planet each week was kind of de facto, So I like the thinking behind it. I've decided that the bridge periscope should be called the Pointless Periscope, because apparently it was. JMS actually went off it pretty rapidly, and then used it a couple of times. And he was laughing at himself. He said there were about 11 minutes of exposition by the alien bloke on the bridge, and he was just like, that's just the writer going off on one basically and being overindulgent. And he was the writer of this episode, so it's self-aware criticism, I think, after the event. Bless him. But it was, as an introduction to the series, it probably would have worked quite nicely because there was a degree of sort of visual exposition going on as part of that, so it would have worked. And apparently there's reference here to the Book of Job as well. And JMS says he quite likes using sort of background reference sources because it means that you can sort of write assuming that people are going to see those sort of echoes, and therefore you don't actually have to write as much. It's an interesting one because I don't know to what extent people universally know this sort of stuff, but I guess if you know your audience, then you can kind of code for that. Now, again, interestingly, the Apocalypse box, apparently Gideon would have died at the end of this season, or nearly died from a gunshot, and he would actually have sort of, a part of him might have ended up in the box. For how long, I'm not quite sure, but apparently that was to do with the price you paid for accepting the box in the first place. You actually get this sort of link to it in some way, shape or form, and that's what the Ace of Spades card was kind of hinting at. So interesting one. Now the other curious thing I found out doing a little bit of research off the back of this episode, I've always quite liked the Jarena character. She's always struck me as being very well played. And apparently JMS said that they picked her because they needed someone who could sort of fit into small spaces, and she's quite little. But what I hadn't realised was that she was actually in Babylon 5 before. She played a couple of extras roles in Season 3 and Season 4, so she wasn't actually new to the Babylon 5 universe as a whole. She hadn't played this character before, apart from Call to Arms, of course, but she had actually been around the sets before, clearly. But she was also a character in Hypernauts. So you can go and, I won't tell you much about it, but suffice to say that Hypernauts was a series like Babylon 5 that mixed CGI and live action in a way that hadn't really been seen to that point, but it was for kids. But it did share some creative talents with Babylon 5. So it makes perfect sense that she would have sort of known enough to be caught up with that. But I think it was actually before Crusade that Hypernauts happened, but that makes sense given that I've now found out that she was involved with Babylon 5 a bit earlier. So I think she was just I'm not sure if she was just a voice actress, but anyway, she was in that. So she did have that bit of activity around that sort of time with these sorts of series, but she doesn't seem to have done a great deal after that. A little bit more voice work, I think, but that was about it, unfortunately. So that was that. So I've only got 10, 11, 12, 13, 4 more episodes of Crusade left. And whilst I know it doesn't get a huge amount of love, indeed it does seem to be this rather sort of forgotten child of the Babylon 5 franchise, I am still quite enjoying it. It was nice to get the JMS commentary on this one, because you can tell that he was quite fond of it as a concept, I think, and he obviously had plans for it, and it would have been well and truly within the Babylon 5 universe. There's no two ways about it, and it would have been interesting to see how Lockley was going to be continuing to be involved with it as well. But obviously we only got this very sort of truncated first season, and it's a shame. It's a shame because I think this episode in particular showed the sort of stuff that it could have done, even with the limitations in effects of the day. I think people would have accepted it quite happily. And JMS's commentary is quite sort of amused by the scale of the effects and how certain things were being done, but it definitely had the capacity for growth. And he said that the cast got on really well with each other and stuff, so that none of that was probably going to be a problem either. And he quite enjoyed watching them do their stuff. He was quite happy with the characters that he'd put in place for it, I think is what he was saying. So quite looking forward to the last 4 episodes, just to sort of watch how it did manage to play out as far as it got. And then I'll only have Lost Tales left. I think I've covered everything else. So I think that's it for now. So do like and subscribe as ever, and I will catch you for the next one. Cheers for now.